Hello, everybody, and welcome to Books in Hindsight. I'm your host, author Matthew Heins. Today we have an amazing guest. We have author and activist and filmmaker John de Graaf to talk about his book, Affluenza. Now, it's going to be a fantastic podcast. So before we bring John out, let's just remind everybody that we have a new logo, which means we have a new line of designer t-shirts and other, I guess we'll say, merchandise here at Books in Hindsight. So go ahead and check out our new styles. We have producer, we have our signature shirt, we have our Born to Read shirt, and of course, we have podcast guests for all of you podcast guests out there or those who wish to be. So it's a fantastic time at Books in Hindsight, but it's going to be even more fantastic in a minute because we're going to bring out author John de Graaf. So without further ado, let's go to the phone.
Welcome to Books in Hindsight, the only podcast where hindsight is always 2020. And we explore the great books, works, and ideas of the century. Now, here's your host, teacher, and author, Matthew Heins.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Books in Hindsight. As I promised you, I have the amazing author. I have John de Graaf. He is the author of the book Affluenza. Affluenza talks about the consumer culture in the United States and our endless need for consumption in order to find some kind of a fake happiness. So we are really happy to have John on the show today. So John de Graaf, welcome to Books in Hindsight.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on your program.
Well, it is a real honor to have you on here. John, you travel a lot, and it was very difficult to even track you down to get you on the podcast. Can I just ask you where your next sojourn is going to take you?
My next sojourn is it's taking me first to California and then to South Carolina. So no big travels, not like all your travels to the Middle East and everything like that. I'm a little bit familiar with some of your writings, and I have a feeling that you've traveled more than I have.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe we'll sit down and compare travel logs sometime. So, John, let's talk a little bit about your books. And for the people that are listening, this is John de Graaf, and he is the author of Affluenza. Now, Affluenza has come out in 2 editions. The first edition came out, and that was in 2005. And it was called Affluenza, the all-consuming epidemic. And then John re-released the book in 2014, and it is Affluenza, How Overconsumption is Killing Us and How to Fight Back. Now, John also has a couple of other books, What's the Economy For Anyway, and Take Back Your Time. Now, and John also has a website, johndegraaf.com. So obviously, and with your video, John, you are a busy, busy man. Yes?
I think I'm a pretty busy guy, although, sometimes I find that my friends are busier than I am. Actually, Affluenza, believe it or not, the first edition came out in 2001. And literally the publication date was September 11th. 2001. So needless to say, the book did not take off right away because obviously we know what happened on September 11th, 2001. But by about Christmas time, people were starting to pay attention to the book, and it did do very well. The second edition, as you mentioned, came out in 2005, and then a third edition in 2014.
Okay, so John, can you just tell us a little bit about your background? I mean, you obviously are interested in consumerism, which talks about economics, and according to your biography, you're a filmmaker and you're an activist as well. So we just want to know, and I'm sure our podcast audience wants to know, what seems to get you fired up.
Well, as I often say, I wear several hats badly, or many hats badly. But my profession really has been a filmmaker, and I've done about 40 documentaries, about 15 national PBS films. And actually, Affluenza began as a film. It was a 1997 PBS special. It was my one Andy Warhol 15 Minutes of Fame. Most of my documentaries ended up in the ozone layer, but that one kind of took off. A lot of people watched it, and I got asked to do speaking about it. I got asked to write a book, which I then did, and that kind of launched me into some other things, some of the things you're talking about, doing more writing, doing more public speaking, and becoming an activist about the issues that I previously had only covered in film. My interest has always been in the general topic of what I would call quality of life. So Affluenza really is an argument for putting quality of life above quantity of stuff. And I think that really comes from childhood experiences, which I'm happy to talk about, but you may have other questions.
Well, no, your childhood experiences are fine. And also, if that could just kind of lead into your education, excuse me, your education and your, excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold, and your, basically your education and what got you interested in people's economic happiness.
Okay. Well, to go back, I think it really does start. I was asked this question once by a student when I was giving a talk at Western Washington University. You know, what do you think got you so interested in this whole question of quality of life as an obsession with your life, which it sort of is. It's sort of weird to have quality of life be an obsession. But anyway, supposed to be more laid back about that. But in any case, what happened was that when I was 10 years old, my dad took me backpacking for the first time. And a couple of years later, he took me on a long backpacking trip in Yosemite National Park. And then he also took my best friend on backpacking trips, and we learned to be pretty good at backpacking, good enough so that by the time we were 14 years old, after our first year of high school, freshman year, when summer started, my dad drove us to Yosemite and dropped us off. And my friend's parents picked us up 2.5 weeks later, so it wasn't that long a trip, but we were on our own. Call home once a week, collect. Remember those days when you called home, collect, and no cell phones, of course, and all of that. And then in the following years, the following 3 years after high school, I spent 6 weeks, getting ahead of myself here, 6 weeks each summer in the mountains with my friends on our own. We hiked for a week, from trailhead to trailhead, carrying our gear. We hitchhiked to small towns to resupply. And we had a great life doing all of this. I had freedom that kids these days simply cannot imagine, I don't think, having. And I learned a lot from backpacking. I learned that really you can definitely have too little. And sometimes we had too little food or too little water. Or one time we didn't have mosquito repellent and it was the wrong time not to have mosquito repellent, so we got eaten alive. Those things happen. Sometimes the bears get your food because you didn't store it properly. So you learn some lessons when you're backpacking, but the other lesson you learn is that usually the big problem isn't too little, it's too much. That you carry too much and you're somewhat miserable as a result of it. I love the movie Wild with Reese Witherspoon because she's starting out to hike the Pacific Crest Trail. She has this enormous pack. She puts it on her back. It's stuffed with everything she thinks she's going to need on this 2,600-mile hiking journey. And she falls flat on her back. And she has trouble. She's like a beetle or a turtle that's turned over and can't right herself. And she finally extricates herself with a good deal of swearing. And realizes that she's got to take a lot of things out of that pack and leave them. And on the trail, she even finds that there are other things she doesn't need. She gives them away to people. It's a great image, and it's what I have found to be true as well, which you learn backpacking, is that you can have a great time with very little stuff. That what makes you happy is the companionship and friendship you have on the trail. It's the sense of exercise and good feeling that you get from hiking. It's the sense of adventure and novelty because it's always something new. It's the beauty of nature, which of course for me was probably the most compelling thing, just stunning to be in those mountains. It's a sense of needing to have persistence. I mean, there's so many things like that you learn that are important. And what you learn isn't important is just having a whole lot of stuff. I took that for the rest of my life, I think, as a metaphor for life. And I think of it now as a metaphor for the United States. I think of the U.S. as a backpacker whose backpack is way, way too big. We're stuffed with everything under the sun. We're struggling as a result. We're flat on our back. We're angry. The straps are digging in. We're blaming everything and everybody, immigrants, gays, Muslims, blacks, women, you name it, regulations, taxes, for this pain that we're feeling instead of what's really causing it, which is terrible priorities and not having sometimes enough of what we need. I had a student who said once, we've got a defective first aid kit in our pack, and that's using the metaphor in a great way. But having way too much of kind of stuff that's junk and that is weighing us down. And so unless we change our priorities and rearrange our backpack and get rid of some things, and that's what I think affluenza is about, the sickness of having too much of this kind of stuff, I don't think we're going to be happy in the future, wall or no wall.
Okay, John, I want to jump in here for a second because I absolutely perfectly agree with you. And let's start going back to your example of you and your friends as the noble savages, and you're out there and you're just carrying around what you needed. And basically, I spent my military career like in the infantry, and I spent 4 years carrying everything I needed on my back. And I had to jump out of airplanes and pick it up and then go carry it around. So I absolutely firmly agree with you. And this is something that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a consumer culture. But before we get into that, let's just talk a little bit about, did you hear about George Carlin's thing about why you have
stuff?
A house to keep
sure.
stuff? And then you need a bigger house. And that's one thing that when I learned a whole different culture in the military, and that was the culture of you just have what you need. And I people said, "Oh, you're Spartan," and they would look at my room and stuff, and I said, "Well, this is just the stuff I need for the Army. I'll have other stuff later." And people they called me the Spartan because I didn't have anything, but because I didn't need anything. I mean, the Army gave me everything I needed. So, except for like civilian clothes and stuff. So I completely understand the idea, and it's very few people that have that outlook on life of what you really need to survive. So, and then you get into George Carlin and American culture talking about you go out shopping. Why? Just to get more stuff. You need a bigger house to get more stuff to put your stuff in. And is this where you're going with Affluenza?
Yeah, I mean, I love the George Carlin monologue about that as well. And yeah, I was doing a film for a PBS about overconsumption in America and its impacts. And it started out kind of as an environmental film, what's the damage to the environment? It started out as a kind of a heavy, guilt-trippy sort of film. And I realized that wasn't going to work particularly well. And so I was looking for a way to make it more humorous, you have a little sugar to make the medicine go down, if you will. And I was reading an article that had this throwaway word affluenza in it. And it's like the light bulb that goes off in your head in the cartoons, it's like, this is it. And I literally grabbed my co-producer, Vivian Bowe, and said, Vivian, look at this. This is it, affluenza. first she was a little skeptical, but I said, look, with this, if we think of this as a disease, then we can structure this documentary around the symptoms of the disease, the history or epidemiology of the disease, and then finding the treatment of the disease. So editing is going to be easy because this is all going to edit itself. And I then called PBS, which was expecting this documentary, and talked to my contact at PBS in DC and said this, and she said, Affluenza, well, I don't know about that, but you're the producer. Do what you want to do. So we did, and it turned out to be the luckiest thing I think I have ever done in my history of filmmaking, because not only was the word Affluenza, AFF, right at the head of the alphabet, which means that we were number one in the PBS website for programs, but it also really did give viewers a chance to think about this. And ever since then, I've realized how powerful metaphor can be in trying to make complex issues understandable for people, issues that go in many, many different directions, as certainly this one did.
Right, and Affluenza is such an amazing name because it covers the disease, it covers the, people can figure out, affluence. And so it's basically an entire sentence in one word. So let's talk about, you're talking about Affluenza as a disease, but you're attacking American culture, because isn't our culture consumerism? I mean, don't we need to go out and buy things to get better? And when we get sick, we need to go buy something that's going to, go get some medicine. We need to buy that to make us better. So would you say that what you call consumer culture is American culture?
Oh, I'd say so. I'd say that it's America's addiction. It's call it what you want. I mean, a lot of people are using opioids, but I think our real addiction is consumerism as a country. And I think we don't understand the cost of it. We understand the benefits because it kind of keeps our big economy growing, and we think we really need to do that all the time. But I don't think we understand the cost to it. But what really surprised me, though, is that some people do, and it's not a political thing so much. It cut across politics. When the film Affluenza came out, I certainly got as much response to that film from self-described conservatives as from liberals. In fact, the biggest sales of the film to universities of the film was to Brigham Young. And I had a call from the head of promotion at the Salt Lake City PBS station when they ran the show, and she said, your show is the first show for a long time we've had on the station that both sides of our community have responded to positively. The Mormons like it, and the people who came here just to get away. A lot of people actually came to Salt Lake because they lived in other parts of Utah that were all Mormon, and they went to Salt Lake because it was more secular. He said those folks, the environmentalists and all of them, like it too. And I found that it spoke, especially with its message about the way our society targets and markets to children and tries to turn children into consumers, kids as customers, it's called, from a very, very early age. That resonated with parents across the political spectrum, and they were not happy about it. And when we showed, for example, a marketing conference where the marketers were basically describing children as targets, parents were gatekeepers who were standing between the children's money and the marketers. They were discussing such things as the nag factor. How many times do kids have to nag till their parents will buy them what they want? How do we get them to nag? They talked about social behavior when it comes to kids as customers as being a good thing. And the keynote speech at the conference, which we were not allowed to videotape. We were allowed to videotape quite a bit, but we were not allowed to videotape the keynote speech, which was by the marketing director of McDonald's. And it was called Softening the Parental Veto. Get it? And I think when people saw that, they said, geez, we don't want our kids to grow up like that. We want them to have other kinds of values. And so we looked at a lot of things. Some of it was then seemed comical, but now it's even more like we went and visited a guy with 4 garages in his house. And he didn't have any, and he had all his cars. He had several cars on a boat and everything. They were all parked outside. They weren't in the garages. So we said, well, what do you use the garages for? And he said, well, storage, because I have all this other stuff. And you can never have enough storage, he said to me, and this is in the film, so you can never have enough garages. And I thought, wow, this is really something. You don't even using this stuff. And then he had storage lockers that he paid for on top of that. I said, is this crazy or what? Is this a good life? And I mean, he seemed like a fairly happy-go-lucky guy, so I won't say he was miserable or anything like that, but this sort of thing is just not sustainable.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of the issue here, is that it's not really sustainable, and I don't know how I could not, even if I had $1 billion, I would still live in a simple house, because I just don't feel like I need that stuff, and I'd probably just give my money to somebody. But John, you have been classified as a champion of human happiness. And so obviously that you've, spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff. And let's go back to this idea of your friend. He who dies with the most toys wins. You've heard that before. Okay. So that's deeply ingrained in American culture. I want to ask you something. I hope it's not too politically incorrect, but is there a gender that seeks consumer gratification more than another one? Do you understand my question?
Well, that's a good question. And I actually, I don't want to take it light, because I don't really know the answer. I think women may shop more. I think there's no question about that. And a lot of young women say shopping is their favorite activity. And you don't hear that too much from guys. On the other hand, guys tend to buy a lot more big ticket items, which are probably more destructive in the long run for the environment. And so it's hard to answer that kind of question. And of my friends, I would say that my female friends tend to understand the idea of overconsuming and of simplicity more than my male friends. So that may be a gender thing. But on the other hand, we also do know that for many teenage girls, for example, when asked what their favorite activity is, they will say shopping. That's much less true for guys.
Right. So, and I only asked that question because I wanted to follow it up with, what do you find equal, I guess excitement is the word I'm looking for, towards your books from men and women? Are both equally interested in the topic?
I do get a good response, I think, from both men and women. But to be honest, I think I get a better response from women. I think women are Ashley Montagu, the great anthropologist, once wrote a book called The Natural Superiority of Women. And I've kind of found that to be true, because I do think, and it may not be, I'm not saying this is a genetic thing at all. I think men and women are, not genetically inclined to be one or the other. But I think our society does tend to socialize women more to be more caring, more interested in things like connection and friendship, beauty, nature, all of those things. And it socializes guys to be more interested in power, in prestige, in these kind of things. So in that regard, I think women are more open generally to the message. But there are plenty of exceptions, of course, and I don't want to do any rulemaking here.
Okay, well, yeah, and I would think that for a lot of women, especially women who want to be not stigmatized as women, that this might be an avenue for them to say, hey, I'm not born to shop, and I'm concerned about these things that matter as well. And I don't like being stigmatized as somebody that goes out and spends their whole life shopping for things. And the only, I just noticed that, like, when I get married or got married, I started to accumulate more things, and it was really against my will. And I'm a very stubborn person, and I'm always saying, we don't need that, and where are we going to put that? And I always resist presents and everything, because I just say, I have everything I could possibly need. I have more than I need, so don't buy me anything. But there's that emotional factor in there. And so let's talk about, in our society, we have a consumer society. Do you address in Affluenza the idea that we live in a consumer society, but we don't have enough money to pay for the things that we want to buy, and so then we have to rely on credit? Do you address that?
Yeah, well, it's certainly true. And of course, this is more complicated today than it was when we made the film, and even when I wrote the book, because we made the film in the late 1990s, which was a time of sort of great prosperity in America. We sometimes think we're back into that again. I'm not nearly so sure, but a great period of prosperity, and the sense that this would go on forever, and that we had licked the economic problems, and people would always keep having higher salaries, and unemployment was low, and all of that kind of thing. And so that was the period, the age of Affluenza, I think. But when I wrote the book, and when we did this, I was actually criticized by Elizabeth Warren for the book and for the concept, saying, well, many Americans really don't have the basics. And many of our bankruptcies, which is true, half of American bankruptcies were caused by people who didn't have health insurance and couldn't cover medical bills. And she said, so you are kind of blaming the victim for this particular problem. And I thought, there's an element of truth to that. I mean, there really is, because the things we really need have been starved over many years. The need, education, health, the ability to get into a home without paying through the teeth. So we're seeing enormous homelessness. We're seeing all of these kind of things. So these most basic things. College. When I went to the University of Kent, you asked about my education. I'm a college dropout, but I started at the University of California at Berkeley in 1964, the year of the free speech movement. It was, at that time, I don't know where it stands now, but at that time it was considered the number one public institution in the United States for higher education. I went to Berkeley absolutely free. There was no tuition. Everybody went to Berkeley for free. We didn't come out of school with a lot of debt. After my first year, I dropped out because college and I were never on the best of terms, and I joined the Domestic Peace Corps, VISTA. And they sent me to an Indian reservation in northern Wisconsin, where this kid from the California suburbs experienced not only real poverty, but 30 degrees below zero, no running water, all kinds of things like that. And also, for the first time, really saw racism and its pernicious impact in that community. And so 2 years on that reservation, I learned a lot. And then I went back to school at the University of Wisconsin and paid $300 a semester. Not free, but still, again, you're not coming out with these huge debts. So nowadays, Elizabeth Warren was right to point it out that some of the basics we can't pay for, but the consumer goods just become cheaper and cheaper and more. And the idea that you need a new cell phone every year, all of this kind of stuff, that's still true. And that part of what I had to say, I don't take back at all. I think there's a hell of a lot of waste in consumerism in our society.
Well, John, you're going to have to clarify this argument with Elizabeth Warren, because I do not understand when you don't make enough money. And let's talk about, it's a proven fact. 97% of Americans or 90% of Americans are, 2 weeks away from 2 paychecks away from homelessness? Okay, so
yeah, 2 paychecks, probably right.
We're talking about choices of what you do with that limited amount of money that all Americans make. I mean, it doesn't matter if you make $100,000 a year, you're going to spend $100,000 a year trying to be affluent, right? So how does Elizabeth Warren blame the person who gets sick? How does she blame them? Because it's the culture. It's what we're taught to do.
Well, again, I think we have to distinguish as a society. I mean, people are under enormous encouragement. It is part of the culture. It is the socially sanctioned addiction in our society is to have more and more and more. And when you have a president like Trump, you're dealing with the most extreme form of affluenza. This certainly was, Obama may have been in the top 1%, but he never flaunted it. He wasn't all about money. In fact, many of his speeches were about being concerned with something more important than money. In fact, when I first met him, that's what he talked about when he was a senator. Trump, on the other hand, his whole life has been about consuming glitz, stuff, gold, money, gambling. I mean, you name it. And this is held up as the American dream. And so the fact that a lot of people, unfortunately, get caught up in it is not a surprise to me. Now, there are many people who are smart, and what I am impressed by is I'm meeting many millennials, young people, who are saving money, who are not buying this. Some of them are into what they call minimalism. We used to call it voluntary simplicity, same kind of thing. But this is impressive that these kids are saying, wait a minute, no, I need to save money. I need to do those kind of things. It's not all about spending now. And then there are other things, or people, I think some more people are spending more on experiences and things like travel, which can be just as problematic as buying stuff. But at least it is showing some change in their sense of what will make them happier. And I think in that regard, they're correct.
Okay. Well, John, I'm just going to jump back into consumer culture for 1 second here and remind people that we are talking to John de Graaf. His book is Affluenza. He also has a couple of other books, Take Back Your Time, and What's the Economy For Anyway? And Affluenza comes in 2 editions, and also there is a video. I believe there's a number of videos that deal with Affluenza, but these are all available at my website, booksinhindsight.com, and John's website is johndegraaf.com. All right, John, so we've been talking about, and we've been picking on Americans, and at the beginning of the podcast, you talked about how I had been overseas, and you have also been, to the Middle East as I have. And when I went to Oman in 2001, just a couple months after your book came out, I could not believe the consumerism and the consumer culture, the cell phones, the new cars. Everybody has a new Land Cruiser. Everybody gets a new house. It was just, everything was brand new. I mean, nothing had been built before the late 90s or the early 90s. So everything was brand new. And I walked smack dab into something that I could not even believe. So, John, you've been around the world now, and you've talked in the Middle East as well. Do they have a problem with consumer culture as well, do you think?
Well, that's a really good point. My only experiences in the Middle East, I've been there twice, but both to the same place. I was twice invited in the same year to go to Dubai, which has to be the world capital of consumerism. The biggest shopping malls of the world. Everything is just as you speak. All the cars are brand new. Everybody's driving Lexuses. The freeways put LA to shame. I mean, this is like the megalopolis of consumerism. And, it was an interesting experience because I was actually invited because of Affluenza. Yeah, so I was giving this talk about Affluenza, invited to the staff of the Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates up in the Emirates Tower in Dubai. Many, many stories looking out at the city, beautiful place, women bringing in wonderful coffees and things. There was a number of women in the meeting too, so it wasn't completely a male deal. But this one gentleman who was clearly a high up and a wealthy Arab individual started talking to me, and he wasn't crying, but I swear he was close, and just saying that his kids were making him crazy, that he couldn't deal with their demands for more and more stuff, and he didn't know how, and he didn't want them to grow up thinking that life was all about stuff. He knew from his own background that was not the case, but that the pressures were very difficult, and I really didn't have any answers for him. It was so I have seen that part of the world. Now, interestingly enough, I went there on the invitation to a happiness conference because Dubai is actually interested in the whole issue of happiness. Now, the other place I went to be as a consultant to the government on the issue of happiness, basically about the issue of time and overwork, which has been a subject of interest to me, was Bhutan, where they started the concept of gross national happiness. You could not find two more opposite countries that are working on happiness. The only two countries in the world that have ministries of happiness are Bhutan and the United Arab Emirates. They're polar opposites. Bhutan is one of the poorest countries on earth, but it still faces issues of young people getting caught up in consumerism and wanting the iPhones and wanting these, and it's trying to preserve its culture. And it does really understand that happiness is not about, he who dies with the most toys wins, that it's about social connection, and it's about place and caring and nature. And so Bhutan is working very hard to try to protect those things in its culture and art. I mean, it's a place where you're surrounded by art. You're literally in the middle of everything is beautiful, and yet it's very poor. But I'll tell you, I would rather go back to Bhutan and spend time there anytime than to go back to Dubai. Anytime.
Yeah, I guess having worked there, I guess it depends on the salary that they're paying you as to where you would choose to live. You've opened up a can of worms on a couple of fronts here, so we're going to have to just stay in the Middle East for a second. And it was my experience, and I lived there for 13 years. I lived in Oman and Saudi Arabia. Now, Oman is a little bit different than the Emirates in that they are not, they weren't so quick to develop. They wanted a more slower, they wanted to basically see what consumerism was. But they all agree that they can't keep buying things from other countries, that they had to produce the things that they consumed, which is very difficult in the desert. And I made the point, and I wrote my book about living in Oman in 2005, and I made the point, we talked about this, is that I made the point that we were basically dumping all this technology on their shores, and it was eroding their culture. And is this, and then you talk about a guy who, in the Muslim culture, you have to put everybody before yourself, and suddenly the consumerism, we nailed him with consumerism, and we nailed him with the money, and we nailed him with the credit. And so all these young kids, and these guys have 4 or 5 wives. So this is affluenza on steroids, because they have to have the Lamborghini, they have to have a Land Cruiser, they have 4 wives, each wife has like 4 or 5 kids. So this just costs so much money. And it was always my point about the Middle East that at some point they would reach a critical mass, and there was just not enough money from the oil to go around. And then the oil prices dropped. So when was the last time you were in Dubai?
2017.
Okay, and did you
2 years ago?
Is this when you had your run-in with this gentleman? Or I won't say run-in.
It wasn't a run-in. I mean, he was very sympathetic to what I was saying, and he was supporting what I had to say, and most of the people there were. In fact, the health director there was talking about, can we find a vaccine for affluenza? Mm-hmm. And he was only talking about that half in jest, because they actually understood what I was talking about, and I wouldn't have been asked to be there if they weren't concerned about it. So I think they were wonderful people. They were absolutely, completely hospitable and kind. And, I could not have been treated better. But the culture the pressure is huge for this society of glitz and all of that. And yet they know that this is probably, the oil is not going to be around forever, and that this whole thing is a house of cards, that they can't continue to just be a place where people come and shop forever. So I don't know. I don't know what they're going to do, but it was an interesting experience, but it's not necessarily one I need to repeat. But again, I'd love to go back to Bhutan, because that culture absolutely fascinated me.
Okay, well, John, I don't want to jump over to Bhutan until we have finished with our friends in the United Arab Emirates. Did you mention that affluenza starts with personal choices?
It does and it doesn't. I think people do make personal choices, but I think our society, and probably theirs, are structured in ways that really are simplicity unfriendly, that really, kind of push us, the jobs that are available, more and more are in marketing and sales. And, when you look at what we're surrounded with, and some people can resist that. Some of us are lucky enough. Some of us grew up at a time when we didn't care about those things, and we still don't. But I'll tell you, when I see the number of marketing messages that we are dealing with in this culture today, the massive efforts to, we talk about social engineering. Some of the conservatives talk about, they don't want this liberal social engineering. We have massive social engineering in the society. It's called marketing. There is not a space left in our culture where there isn't an ad, and they're looking for more and more places to put them. And of course, the internet is a place now where they can mine what you actually think and who you are, and then target you with ads to get you to buy more things. This is pernicious. I mean, this is a very dangerous kind of thing, and it will ultimately destroy us, because we not only will we run out of resources, but that happens, and it's destroying our social connections and all of those kind of things. The more stuff we have and pay attention to on an individual basis, the less time we have to take care of our health, to be out with other people, to share camaraderie, all of those kind of things. But I think you can exhort people to behave differently, and I do that. I said, don't consume so much, and certainly I might raise my son that way, and he's been good about it. He's one of those millennials who isn't spending and is saving, but the pressure is enormous, and I think this is a systematic problem. It is not just a personal problem.
Okay, and the more I'm sitting here listening to you, John, we've talked about the problems, and we've talked about the disease. The disease is affluenza, but in the title of your book, you tell us how to fight back. So how do we fight back against affluenza?
Well, I think there's a number of ways.
The whole thing, but just give us a couple steps.
We can fight back on a personal for you.
John, I think I'm losing you. Are you there?
Yeah, and you stopped for a second too, so I think there's something wrong with the internet connection, but
Yeah, that's all right. We're almost done.
yeah. So anyway, what I wanted to say is, how can we fight back? Well, we can fight back by trying to save, by being, there's funny things you can do. My friend Vicki Robin, who wrote Your Money or Your Life, which is a great book that people should read to think about their spending habits and how they can save. And millennials are doing that. They're loving that book. And one of the suggestions that Vicki had was what she called a credit card condom, or a credit card prophylactic, call it what you want. Anyway, this credit card condom is really just a little envelope that you put your credit card in. And on the outside of the envelope, it asks you some questions like, do I really need this? How much time will I have to work to buy this? Where was this made? Et cetera, et cetera. So that when you pull out your credit card to buy something, you're at least confronted with some questions, so you may think twice. And if you use this kind of thing, we used to joke and say you could practice safe shopping. This is and the kind of joke was that don't leave home without it, because the idea is that people are spending more than they need to spend for sure. But the other thing is, I think we need to change this culture so that we put more. Way back in 1957, John Kenneth Galbraith in The Affluent Society, which was a great book of its time, talked about private affluence and public squalor, that we were diverting resources that we could be using publicly to provide things that we really need, parks, nature, and things like that, health care, education, you name it. And we were diverting those to pure private spending on consumer goods. And that was problematic. And it's still problematic. The other price we really pay is to think about how much we are working in this country in order to buy this dream of constant growth in consumption. Americans work longer hours than people in virtually any other rich country other than South Korea. About the same as the Japanese, way more than people work in Europe, for example. People in Europe have made a choice to trade some of that stuff, some of that money, for leisure time, for the form of long vacation, shorter work weeks. They are far better off for that choice. They are healthier, they live longer, they are happier, they are less stressed. And so I founded the Take Back Your Time movement with others back in 2002 as an antidote to affluenza, saying, why don't, instead of saying, oh, let's feel guilty about consuming too much, let's ask a different question. What are we giving up? Why are our ambitions so low? Why are we asking for so little out of society that all we're asking for is more and more of this junk that doesn't make us happy anyway? And we're forgetting the stuff that's really important, which is the time we need for our friends and our family and nature and exercise and art and beauty and you name it. So we started that campaign. Okay. So after Affluenza, a lot of us got together and we said, we want to do something about consumerism. We want to do something to promote simplicity, other things, but we can't take consumerism on head on, just saying, guilt tripping people and saying you're consuming too much, stop spending. That doesn't work very well. So we thought we would take the opposite strategy. What are we giving up for this culture of consumption? And we argue that, in fact, we as Americans are demanding much too little. We're being satisfied with junk and stuff and this consumer culture, which is not making us happy, when we could, in fact, have instead time for friends, for each other, for nature, leisure, shorter working hours, all of those kind of things, which would clearly make us happier and have made Europeans happier. So we started an organization called Take Back Your Time. I was with it for 15 years, from 2002. I think we made some progress. We worked on issues like paid family leave, paid sick leave, I was involved with 3 vacation bills, one in the U.S. Congress, went nowhere, needless to say. I had the chance to be on Fox News when the vacation bill was entered into the U.S. Congress, and the Fox News host, I think it was Neil Cavuto, I was in a studio in Seattle and he was wherever he was. And so he's literally like points at me and he says, you want to turn America into a 21st century. He paused for effect. France. And I'm thinking, oh my God, no, not that. Oh no, we're going to force everyone to appreciate good food and wine. And but this was how the dialogue went about this kind of thing, and so we were not able to get that through. We introduced 2 bills in the Washington legislature through my wonderful state senator Gail Tarleton. I testified twice in committee on those. They did not pass, but I think time is getting to where we may be able to get this to happen. We've gotten paid family leave now. We've gotten sick leave. The city of New York passed a vacation law. And so I do have a meeting with some folks from the Seattle City Council coming up next week to talk about introducing vacation legislation in the Seattle City Council. Maybe we can be the second city in America to make it. But that's what I think we need to do. We need to substitute time and things like that for this emphasis on more and more things. And then we have to be a hell of a lot more fair. I mean, as we become more and more unequal, and as people see on TV the lifestyles of the rich and famous, as the Joneses changed, because when I was growing up, the Joneses were the people next door. They drove a Chevy and you drove a Chevy, and keeping up with the Joneses was relatively easy. Now the Joneses drive an Escalade or they fly in a Learjet, and it's a little tougher. But this is kind of what people feel like they have to do. And so we have to change this and get rid of this kind of inequality. I'll get really radical here and take my stand with St. Augustine, who advocated a maximum income. That was one of the things he said there needed to be, not just a minimum wage, but a maximum income. Because when people can make enormous amounts of money and live lifestyles that are based on that, that becomes an influencer for others, and everyone feels they have to keep up. And when your goal is money, and that you can never have enough. That's the one thing that we know, that people who are obsessed with money and with stuff, they're never satisfied. We know that people who make $15,000 a year in the United States, when asked how much they would need to be happy, say $30,000, or twice as much. We know that people who make $1 million a year in the United States, when asked what it'll take to be happy, say $2 million. No matter what it is, double it. And then when you get it, double it again. So it's a treadmill. We are hamsters, running around in a hamster wheel or climbing on a treadmill for this crazy goal of growth and stuff, when in fact we have plenty in this country. We do not need more money or more stuff in America. We need to distribute it more fairly. We have people who don't have nearly enough in our society, but that's what we need to do. We don't need to cut taxes and do all these things so we can grow more. Why do we need to grow?
Right.
It's insane. We're already consuming at a rate that would, if everybody in the world consumed the way we do, would require 5 planets.
Right.
So, we have to turn this around. One thing that excites me, and I'll finish with this. One thing that really excites me right now is this thing called the Green New Deal. And I think the one thing that needs to be added to the Green New Deal is some kind of critique of consumerism, because the production of consumer goods produces a heck of a lot of the greenhouse gases that we're dealing with. We don't count it here because we use the stuff. We ought to get blamed for it, but in fact, it gets made in China and India and other places, so they get dinged for it. They're the ones whose carbon producing this stuff. So it's talking about really fighting climate change, really rethinking our economy. And while I don't agree with every aspect of it, I think it opens the door to a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, or a wonderful argument. Yeah, because John, what you are doing is...
Pardon me?
I'm sorry? Yeah, what you're talking about, and let's go back to, Philip Cavuto on Fox News. Basically, what you're talking about is you're talking about stop buying things. Well, if I stop buying things, then doesn't the economy slow down? And if the economy slows down, then everything crashes. So, and I heard somebody from, I think they were a young person from Korea, and they asked, do you save your money? And he said, no, because if I don't save my money, or if I save my money, then people can't continue to have jobs. So in Korea, I guess, they are taught that they need to keep putting their money back into the economy. Now, another example that I want to jump back to is when you're talking about going out camping and you've got a backpack. And my wife and I camp a lot. And we take my old Toyota. It's a 91. I don't buy new cars because old cars are just more reliable and they're easier to fix and cheaper. Anyway, so we go and we throw our stuff in the back of our Toyota pickup and we go drive wherever we want. And we are in the middle of these people drive around with their houses. I mean, they're pulling their houses behind them in this massive $70,000, it's got 5-6 tires, this contraption. And it's like, why don't you just stay at home? This is not camping. It's taking your house out.
With names like Wilderness Adventure.
Yeah, and I just look at these people, I go, what? Why do you really need this? And I understand, like, if you have children and it's a nice little safe haven, but still, why do you need all that? So again, what you're talking about, though, is a basic human instinct. And you're talking about trying to, and you can legislate it, you can get people to try to change their attitudes, but you're talking about a basic human instinct where if you don't have more, you have to be accumulating for that next hard winter, So how do you propose? I mean, that is such a monumental task. And you are going to get people who are going to say, oh, you're going to ruin the economy and you're going to turn us into France and everything else. But if you look at people in France, like a doctor in France, they choose that. They chose to make less money. So until you can get people to choose this, you're talking about a basic human instinct, and it's a very uphill battle.
Well, I do believe that choice is a big part of this, and I do believe Europeans have made a choice to take time. And if you take away the 5 weeks of vacation time or 6, you'd have a revolution on your hands in France because they understand how important it is. One of the problems is people don't realize how valuable leisure is because they don't experience it in this country. But what I would argue is that none of this change is going to happen. Like, we're not going to go bing and everything is going to change fast. It's going to be relatively slow. The economy will handle it fine. We could easily today go to a 4-day, 32-hour work week with that and provide more jobs as a result. Without any sacrifice on the part of the American people. Everybody thought, oh my God, the economy is going to collapse when we had the 40-hour work week. It was understood that people worked a lot more, but economy didn't collapse. It got better when we had a 40-hour work week. Now we seem to believe that the 40-hour work week started in the Garden of Eden, that it's like permanent. It's always been there. Well, it hasn't. And in fact, in the 1930s, on April 4th, 1933, the United States Senate passed a bill which would have made the work week in the United States 30 hours. Anything more overtime. Seriously, 1933, how long ago is that? It's like 86 years or was something else that we thought we could do it on 30 hours. That one didn't pass the House, so it didn't become law. And then 5 years later, we got the 40-hour work week. But nonetheless, it could have. And it probably would not have. And many companies at that time went to 30-hour work weeks. So companies like Kellogg's, for example, had a 30-hour work week from 1930 until 1985.
Yeah.
And it worked very, very well, and it worked wonderful in the community and for people. The problem with it was that eventually all the benefits that had to be added to it, because we didn't have national health care like the Europeans have or things like, so you had to add all that kind of stuff. And when you did that, that made it just too expensive for Kellogg's, and it made it cheaper for Kellogg's to hire fewer people and work them longer because you didn't have to add health insurance. But while they were doing it, I talked to workers at Kellogg's who worked in the 30-hour work week, and they loved it. And they said the community was so together, crime was way down, people were watching, everybody really appreciated it, and especially young people who had kids. We can absolutely do this. We will have to reduce inequality. We will have to raise wages at the bottom so that people working 30 hours will have enough to make ends meet. But this is not stuff we can't do. We just don't have the will to do it. And we might as well, if we want to admit that and say, look, we're just too damn lazy to make any changes in our life. But I don't believe that. I believe America has mobilized for great things in the past. And I think maybe starting with the new Green New Deal, and I'll make another prediction. I think as much as I cannot stand our president, and that should be obvious by now, I do think that in a strange way, he may turn out to be a blessing in disguise, because he may be the last rage of denial about the future that is coming, the last effort to hold on to a lifestyle and a way of life which is simply not sustainable over the long run. And he is doing it so badly that he may turn off enough people that they will be open to something very, very different. At least that's what I hope.
Yeah, well, maybe that will happen, but regardless of what humans do, the impact of this consumerism, because you touched on it, and we touched on it when we're talking about the Middle East, they demand the same, in fact, more things than people in the United States. They want more. They want a new car like every year. They have to have the new cell phone, and et cetera, et cetera. And we're talking about 7 billion, and I don't know how many there are now, but even if you have 2 billion people with our level of consumerism, there will just be nothing left except for we'll just be living in our own crap. And basically that's where we are now. So, you're talking about, it's a philosophical issue, it's an economic issue, it's a government issue, it's a political issue. How do we get people to change their behavior so we're not swimming in our own crap? And there's the rule of France, and then we have the law of the jungle here. And I think that I think that your book is just a great start. But like you say, it's really got to start with the younger people, I believe. So, John, let's kind of tie this off a little bit. Your website is johndegraaf.com, and the book is...
And that's spelled, it's DEGRAAF, because people often do 2 Fs rather than 2 A's and won't find it.
Yeah, let me spell that again, too. It's John, DEGRAAF.com. And the book is actually 2 books we're talking about. The first version was The All-Consuming Epidemic, Affluenza, and Affluenza, how consumerism, I don't have my glasses on, how overconsumerism, overconsumption is killing us and how to fight back. And those are available at Books in Heinessight and as well on Amazon and I believe on Kobo and iTunes. Okay, well, John...
I think they're out there in a lot of places.
Yeah, and and also don't let me forget John's videos. They're fantastic. They're so interesting. And so, John, I want to say thanks for being on the podcast. Would you like to give some final words of wisdom to our listeners?
Well, thanks. It's been a real pleasure. I probably said more than I can go on and on, which is not usually a good thing to do. Is just get people to think about what matters in their lives, what matters in the country. And I really think it's all about quality of life. And once that understanding becomes clear for people, habits change, and hopefully also policies will change.
Yeah, well, something is definitely going to change. Well, John, it's been a great honor. We know you're going to be traveling back to California, so we want to wish you luck, and we want to wish you that your journey will be a safe one. And we sure want to thank you for being on Books in Hindsight. For everybody else out there, just let me tell you one more time. The book is Affluenza, and it's available at booksinhindsight.com, Amazon, iTunes, etc. So, John, thanks for being on the podcast.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you. Have a great day.
Okay, and for everybody else out there, especially you kids, you go out and you get Affluenza because you're going to need this in your life. But for everybody out there, please keep on reading.
This has been Books in Hindsight with your host, Matthew Heinz. Please join us for our next podcast and look for our archives on iTunes and go to theheinessight.com. That's HEINES site.com for great books by Matthew Heinz and other great authors.